First, a quick background. You notice sometimes it's called peer coaching program. Our friends in Japan, they call it reflection round table. We also have sometimes stumbled along and called it a program to develop community and organizations. Fundamentally, it's all the same thing, and you just experienced it there, and it's this idea of getting a group of managers together for 90 minutes to talk about what they do at work and figure out what they might want to do a little bit better, and inject some conceptual material to give them a language and a syntax and some different way of seeing their own experiences. So that's the fundamental concept of it, and that fundamental concept all comes back to what Henry did in the IMPM program and the other university programs starting in 1996, of which Coaching Ourselves is really an offshoot or an evolution of that in some ways. So the different terminology is there really from a marketing perspective. It took us until I didn't even use the term peer coaching until one of the folks who was running a conference for an ATD chapter said, hey, why don't I just call it peer coaching? And I said, sure, why don't you do that? And then all of a sudden a lot more people came, and it just made a lot more sense, and so peer coaching stuck. And then I started doing some research to figure out, who else is calling what peer coaching, and it turns out that the term isn't that widely used, and it does have a fair amount of background if you look at the research in the 80s and the 90s vis-a-vis setting up peer coaching groups to help secondary school teachers apply the new pedagogical approaches they were learning during their professional days in the high schools. So there's a lot of background to it, but so we sort of ran with the term, and frankly it works really well. If you think about peer coaching from a business perspective, you can go to somebody in a large company and you can say, well, I've got a peer coaching program, and they're thinking, well, we'd like to do coaching, but we can't afford to get a coach for everybody else, and peer coaching, that means they coach each other, so that's just a lot more economical. And so you get in the door and you can start talking about what it is and do a pilot, and it really gets going. So that's where the peer coaching came from. The background, and I'll tell you just real brief, I'm not a consultant, I'm not an HR specialist, I haven't spent a lot of time in HR, I'm an electrical engineer, spend much of my life doing computer software. I specialized in speech recognition software. I have a patent in speaker verification software, and I was one of those superstar programmers doing the original yes-no systems in the late 80s, and then we evolved into Siri. I worked for a company that eventually got bought by Nuance. And it was around 2003. I was running a series of software teams for an organization, a US-based organization. I ran the lab here in Montreal. And I started realizing that things weren't going so well. This was the tail end of the dot-com crash. We'd gone through our 3 rounds of layoffs. I was pretty depressed going to work on a daily basis. So were the folks who worked for me. You'd go to work and your objective as a senior director was to try not to do anything in case you get noticed, right? And so that's not really very helpful for the organization if that's your whole goal. So I had this idea, I needed to do something with my management team. I needed to change things up, and I thought some sort of management leadership development. I just had that idea, but really I didn't know anything more. The one thing I did know is I don't want any fluff. I don't want to go to some program at a university and spend $3,000 and listen to all sorts of great stuff and then come back to the office and just frankly be a day late on all my projects. And I grew up in Nortel. If anyone remembers, Nortel was a very large Canadian firm, and I remember as a young manager going to the first young new manager training program, and Nortel was brilliant in the mid-90s, and you'd go to the program and you'd get one of those big binders. Anyone remember the huge binders? And it was sort of the bigger the binder, the better the program, and you get that binder, you stick the binder back on your cubicle, and you sort of collect all these binders. But they have nothing to do with what you're actually doing on a day-to-day basis. So anyhow, I said, I'm going to do something about this for my management team. I'm going to do some management leadership development, but I have no time, I have no money, and I don't want fluff. I'm an engineer, so I want something that works. And engineers, we know what works and what doesn't, right? We're pretty black or white about these things. So I got a chance to talk to Henry, and Henry alluded to this, and the first thing Henry said was, you should read my book. Right? So I said, great, I'll read your book. It was Managers, Not MBAs. This was my first exposure to what I would call anything that isn't pop business. I'd read all the sort of internet crap, business books that came out in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And Henry's Managers, Not MBAs, if anyone's read it, it's pretty involved. You read it, you read a paragraph or two, and then you read it again, and then you read it again, and then you think, okay, I think I see where he's going with this, and I get it. Anyhow, and it sort of clued me into this idea that the key of what Henry was saying is just get people together to talk about what's going on, reflect on their own experiences, and for me that means storytelling about what I did yesterday and the day before, and do that in light of conceptual ideas. And that's a little bit different from saying I'm going to learn conceptual ideas and then apply them. That simply says I'm going to try to figure out what this conceptual idea is, but I'm not going to talk about the idea. I'm going to talk about what I did yesterday, but that conceptual idea will give me, let's say, a broad brushstroke of what's going on, and I can place my own experience within this bigger context that the conceptual ideas are, and start to go through that process of sense making and say, okay, yeah, so maybe I'm very analytical because there's different ways that people do things and I never really thought about that. And then you're doing that with a group of peers. So you're all living the same world, and you're all having similar experiences, and you're all starting to help one another figure out, what you're doing and how it's impacting the environment around you and how you might do things differently. And that eventually led to this Coaching Ourselves, which we eventually founded with Henry in 2007. I quit my day job in 2009. I resigned, and that was it. No more electrical engineering for me. We have this, what we call mainly here in the West, a peer coaching program. It's to a certain degree a packaged peer coaching program. You'll hear from a lot of the other speakers about how they've taken this as a tool and repackaged it in a different service offering. So Andre Feely and Associates, they're talking about a circle coaching service offering, which has Coaching Ourselves inside. Bev Patwell is talking about a service excellence change program for organizations that are looking to have a service focus, and it uses Coaching Ourselves inside, along with other elements that she brings to bear to do the cultural change in the organization. And we tend to, if we're going to sell direct or we have new partners, we'll recommend that they start by offering what can be called a peer coaching program, which is really a cascading program. And our partner, Ole from Denmark, really solidified this for us when he started coming to us and literally selling thousands of licenses all at a time, and he's retired. And I'm like, how do you do that? Like, what are you doing? You're not out there training everybody. So he's like, well, I train a large series of folks to go and run the program themselves. And I'm like, that's brilliant. That's what we have to start doing. So what happens in Coaching Ourselves, very briefly? It's hard to describe. You've got a module, Strategic Blind Spots. I'll let you all run that for about 45 minutes, and then I'm going to step back and ask you just to reflect on what happened and try to project outwards on what would happen if lots of folks in organizations that you know of did this on a regular basis, and how that might impact how they work together and how they organize together. They learn. They talk about what's going on. The relationships deepen. There's trust, and you get that trust honesty thing going in terms of, I know you a bit more, so I'm going to say things that I might not normally say, and then that's going to go into that cycle of I'm a bit more honest, which makes me a bit more trusting, and so on and so forth. And that bleeds into everything that they do on a day-to-day basis. Last year, roughly speaking, 18, maybe upwards of 20,000 managers used it on a semi-regular basis in organizations around the world. And ultimately, it comes back to the original thought that I had as an engineer running this management team was, you know what, I really didn't like working anymore. It was not fun. It wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to build speech recognition products with my team, and this process helped us get back to doing what we love doing and doing it well. And it's a way to help managers work together, enjoy what they're doing, and do it really well. And that was sort of the broad-based mission of this type of approach. Now, as many of you know, this is one of many group-based learning trends that are ongoing in our space right now. Social learning at ATD in Florida over the spring was much more prominent than it had been. They'll start with talk about learning from each other, then they'll talk about social learning. We're going to use the term peer coaching. They're all group-based learning. Otto Scharmer does a great thing now. Henry's just launching the MOOC that's not just a MOOC, but it's a group-based MOOC. So you don't do it as an individual, you always do it as a group. So there's a lot of stuff going on where people are realizing that learning in small groups has got to be a key component to any learning intervention that you're doing in an organization. And especially when you're talking about leadership development and management development. Perhaps not so for learning how to program and these sort of things, but leadership and management, because of the nature of what is leadership and what is management, it is best learned in small groups, at least to a large degree. There's a series of managers in the organization, and they're trained in some way so that they can facilitate a group. And then they go out there and they run groups, and the modules are there for them to run each session around a theme. That's the most simplistic way of viewing what this is. And of course, this gets developed and evolved in all sorts of different ways, depending on where you are and the culture of the organization. In Japan, they have an external facilitator that facilitates it for a great number of sessions. In Denmark, they'll do the training for a day or two, and then the managers go off and run with it. Here, sometimes we'll train up HR folks, and then the HR folks will do the support for the sessions, and then eventually the managers will take it on themselves. It really depends on the context and what you're going to do with it. But ultimately, that's how it works in a nutshell. So what I want to do briefly, read the literature and take a look at what the consulting firms are talking about, and cherry pick articles to a large degree that are going to match the vision that I have. And one of the things that I've read recently, this is in April, and McKinsey Quarterly, they talked about this interesting, the way they framed this I found very interesting. They said executives and managers often think their job is to focus on financial results rather than manage people, and when they neglect people, well, HR steps in. HR wants to help and get everything going, and the senior managers, sometimes they don't like that, they feel uncomfortable, and of course the numbers are much more fulfilling. And so everybody seems to be happy. And what McKinsey is saying in this particular article is this causes the systemic issues in the organization in the long run, right? Because HR should not step in. HR should push back. HR should push back and say, no, you have to deal with these people issues. I can support you and I can give you advice, but I'm not doing it for you, because as soon as I do it with you, I'm your crutch, and you're never going to get to do it yourself, because that's the important thing. So that's what McKinsey's reporting in this particular article, and frankly in some of the other articles. Deloitte too. Deloitte's an interesting one. Everyone follow our space. We have Korn and Ferry is becoming a bigger player. They swallowed up Pivot Leadership and a number of other organizations in our space, and Deloitte as well is becoming quite big in our space. So Josh Burson and Associates. Anyone here read Burson and Associates? A little bit. So Burson's my absolute hero. I love Burson. I read what Burson writes quite religiously, and it's brilliant, because they're about 60 or 70, maybe 80 folks, and all they do is ask companies what they're doing in learning and development. And so then they do all the analysis, and then they put it together. So I can just read their reports and get a pretty good feel of what's going on, broadly speaking, in our industry, the trends, the vendors that are doing well, the things that aren't going so well. Absolutely brilliant. And he really has a quite eloquent way of writing. And he has this yearly Burson report that you can just get for free, and it gives you a lot of really good information in terms of what's going on in our space. Not what you think should be going on, but what's actually going on. Anyhow, and Deloitte, they got bought out by Deloitte, and Deloitte's continuing to make a series of acquisitions in our space. Obviously, at the upper levels, the L&D space there, it's very fragmented, and so it's right for an M&A strategy to pull it all together that some of these guys are doing. So what Deloitte has written, and one of the things that they've spoken about that's through Burson and Associates, is this idea that rather than delivering training, one should think about creating a self-developing organization, right? And your job as an HR professional, frankly, when the CEO is talking to the HR professional, should be, how do you create a self-developing organization? And that doesn't mean training, that means all sorts of different things. And some of the points that Burson makes is people have to make time to teach and coach each other's. Leaders at all levels are teaching these things. People are hired for learning agility. Of course, you hire somebody not because of what they know, but because of their ability to learn new things fairly quickly and be flexible. And learning is valued part of the culture. So this is some of the messaging that is going out to the HR folks, to the CEOs. This is obviously amplification of messaging that these folks are collecting and putting out there. So when I'm talking about coaching ourselves, I'm going to frame it within this context. And I'm going to talk to folks and say, these are some of the trends that are going on. This is what these folks are reporting based on their analysis. And coaching ourselves fits into this as something that you might want to pilot or even do on a very large scale. And that'll get them going with peer coaching. So that's the introduction, the motivation. Real rapidly, the Burson report. If you don't read this, just download it and read it. It's really worth it if you're going to play in the L&D space at all. It's the largest study they do, and it's lovely because it's a longitudinal study. You know, like a snapshot study is quite meaningless, right? The real data comes when we can see the trends, and they ask the same folks year after year after year, and you can see how the evolution of folks' responses goes over a year, and then you'll start to see the trends. What they've seen over the past couple of years is really the number one issue that the senior leaders are reporting about vis-a-vis what HR should be worrying about, or L&D, is culture and engagement. They want the culture and engagement to be fixed, to be better, to be like this. They're going to frame it in a lot of different ways, but these are the kind of terms that are going to come down to it. And the point is, leadership development drives culture and engagement. Originally, and still in many cases, leadership development is thought of as, you know, closing skills gaps and these sort of things. But more and more, leadership development is thought of as the key driver for culture and engagement. And the approach, the way in which you deliver leadership development, has at least as much impact as the content that you deliver. And that's sort of the key message that a lot of folks are learning, which is why the group-based learning and different ways of doing leadership development are becoming important. The old, you know, let's get a vendor, let's make sure the content matches and send people to the classroom and just pay the bill, is not where people are at anymore. We're far more sophisticated, and these sort of messages are coming through in these reports. So that's the important messaging, and this is, again, what these folks are capturing and amplifying. And I'm simply showing this to folks and saying, this is what's going on, and then people start to want to experiment and see how things are different. You know, in many cases, I remember Charles is just there in the back of the room, and I've met Charles many years, and we talk about this. And one of the things that you'll talk in some organizations, and you'll say, yeah, you know, people get together, they'll talk about what's important to them and try to figure out, you know, under the context to help things go along. And some of the folks in organizations will say, well, how can we be sure that they're going to talk about what we need them to talk about? And you're not getting it. It's not about controlling what people talk about to make sure that it happens, because that is not going to result in the type of impact that you're looking for. It might, again, it's a big world. In some organizations, perhaps you have to have a very machine-like, hierarchical, rigid structure, and that's going to be the optimum for performance. But in a large variety of organizations today, that is not going to work out in terms of getting the results that you want from the folks that are working in the organization. The last one, and many of us have seen this, and this is sort of widely reported, when you're looking for folks in the organization, of course, this is one of the key. You need good people to work in your organization, and you know, at a certain point, salary is important, and you have to have more than just a minimum. You have to have a good salary, but at a certain point, salary doesn't make that difference. You can pay people more and more money, and they're not going to perform better and better. But the culture of the organization, the feel of the organization, the way people work together, that's going to make the difference. That's going to help you get the better folks, and that's going to help them work better together to produce the products and services. And so culture engagement, that's the driving factor that the senior leaders, at least according to Burson and Associates, is driving the interventions to improve these sort of things. Couple of links. Anyone follow Glassdoor ever? Yeah, take a look at Glassdoor. Glassdoor is an absolutely smashingly brilliant website. I discovered it 2 or 3 years ago. You know, folks run a lot of engagement surveys in organizations, right? You run this big, massive engagement survey, and you go crazy trying to figure out the questions, or you hire a firm to come up with these great questions, and you do the engagement survey, and you get all this data, and you report the data, and you're not really quite sure what to do with it. So next year you run another engagement survey, and it continues like that, and it's not that good. Now, Glassdoor is where folks who, after they leave an organization, they tell the world what they think about their job, about their boss, about the organization, right? Anonymously, all right? So that's not really that interesting when you have 3 or 4 people. But when you have 10,000 individual responses, you start to get statistically significant data on the organization, right? And so I'll tell any organization that's running an engagement survey to take a look at their Glassdoor data. And if their engagement survey tells them something completely different from their Glassdoor data, then they really should get rid of the engagement survey and save an awful lot of money, because they don't need to do that. And not only do they not need to do that, but it's causing them a lot of problems, because it's making them believe things that really aren't true, because the Glassdoor data, that's the honest truth. So all this kind of stuff is out there, and the world If you have a chance, you must see Estelle Metaye tomorrow. She's doing a much more in-depth discussion on all these sort of the dark web and all the kind of data that we have access to know what's going on in our organization and other organizations and these sorts of things. So this is very important to inform all of us in terms of what we're going to do. So Henry. So I usually introduce Henry. A couple of things, and some of you may know. So Henry's well known in Canada, certainly very well known in Europe and Northern Europe. In the United States, it's dead air. I'll ask, how many people have heard of Henry Mintzberg? And I'm on some webinars with 300 people, and I'll get like 5% will say, I've heard of Henry Mintzberg, right? Now, then I'll ask them who's heard of Ed Schein, and then I'll get everyone. So Ed Schein's more well known in the States. Henry is more well known here. Anyhow, Henry, what's interesting for me vis-a-vis management development is Henry started with his first book in 1973 called The Nature of Managerial Work. And he did this wonderful study at the time. I think it was fairly unique. He actually went and observed managers. Most people wrote about what managers should be doing or what they think managers should be doing so that these hierarchical organizations would work well. This is 1973. And Henry went and just spent a day with a manager. In fact, he did it with 29 managers in 29 different organizations. And he just wrote, this is what, had a meeting, had a call, it got interrupted, yada, yada, yada. And then Henry did what he always does, which is he conceptualized it for all of us and gave us a picture of what's going on in the real world. And sure enough, for anyone who's managed, managers don't do a lot of, planning and strategizing and these sort of things. They run around for the most part, getting interrupted, never really having more than 7 minutes before somebody interrupts whatever it is they're doing. This is what a typical manager does at almost any level in the organization, in almost any organization. And so Henry always continued with this sort of observational study, look at what's going on in the real world, conceptualize it so that the rest of us can understand, and then force all of us to think about this and to face the facts that this is what's going on, so what are you going to do about it? And back in 73, the professors were saying, no, this is what managers should be doing. And Henry says, no, but this is what they are doing. So instead of trying to change what they do, let's help them do what they do a little bit better. And that's where you get into management education. Given that this is what managers do on a day-to-day basis, how can we help them do it a little bit better? And it's not about teaching them about marketing and finance, though that's all very useful. It's about essentially what he came down to, just give a manager an opportunity to stop and think. You go, you run, you do all these kind of things, but you only start to make sense of it if you can just stop and think. And of course, everyone says, I don't have time to stop and think. And study after study shows that those managers that take time to stop and think have time to stop and think. And those managers that don't take time to stop and think don't have time because they never think about what they're doing and they tend to do a lot of foolish things. So Henry continued with that. His work on emergent theory was absolutely another brilliant one in organizational forms and these sort of things. And then he turned his thinking to management education. And as you heard today, what's going on, how are managers getting educated? Certainly the predominant methodology was the case study approach in terms of reading a case study and then thinking about what these actors in the case study should do. And the professors facilitating a very useful discussion about this, injecting conceptual material and helping participants tease out lessons for themselves. And this is certainly valuable and useful. And Henry went on to say, yeah, but there's other ways to do this. And let's, instead of talking about case studies, let's help managers get good at thinking about what they do and talking about what they do. And I know Harvard now has more and more reflective practice and people going out there and working and reflecting on that. And it's certainly, the world is evolving and it's far more nuanced than it was in the 70s and the 80s when all this started. But anyhow, so Henry said, give managers a chance to reflect on natural experience in light of conceptual ideas. That's the most powerful tool we have. So that's it. Just think about what you're doing, which I turned into a storytelling exercise. Tell stories about what you did. I had a meeting yesterday. There was 3 people there. This guy I don't like, and he's an idiot. This guy's kind of good, and this guy always says the same thing. But anyhow, I tried to get on with the business of telling people what was going on and making a decision, and this is what I did. So you're just telling an honest-to-goodness story about what you're doing. Now, telling an honest-to-goodness story about what goes on in your head during a work meeting is very hard to do to the other folks that you work with. That's what you do when you come home, and you're sitting with your partner. You say, you can't believe what happened today. We had that meeting again. The one that we all know is a waste, but we go to anyhow. So that's that kind of conversation that you're trying to get happening in the organization so that you can do something about it. And that's where the small groups and the context and the honesty and the trust develop, and that's where the peer coaching emerges. So that's where the real power and the change start to happen in these small groups. That's not management development. A lot of them are learning an awful lot about management, and there's nothing wrong with learning about management in this sort of a context, but they're not learning to be managers. And that's the key message there. And there's Henry's picture of his IMPM program, IMHL program. So the way I sort of introduce this and to help folks make sense of it, and I'll say, it's a very purist perspective that I'm giving participants on this. I'll say that the professor will start by introducing a conceptual idea. Maybe they'll talk for about 2 or 3 minutes and introduce a little segment of a conceptual idea. Then the professor will drop a question into the table that gets the participants to talk about what they did last week. So they'll tell a story related to that segment of a conceptual idea. And that whole thing will take about 10 minutes. So you've got this little 10-minute cycle. Professor talks, then there's a discussion for a couple of minutes, then it goes back to the professor to talk for another 2 or 3 minutes and introduce a bit more depth or a nuance to the conceptual idea or build on that, and then another question for the participants to continue talking. Yes?
Just a point in general about even this morning's opening remarks. The way I perceive things is an MBA doesn't have the word management in there at all. Aren't we throwing rocks at the wrong thing, which is HR professionals that say, if I want to get management development for an executive, I send them to an MBA program, versus the MBA program being wrong in the first place. And what I mean by that is, I think it may be, frankly, the prescriber's problem, which is the HR professional, that is applying the wrong prescription.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I very much agree with you in terms of that, but what we certainly see out there is most folks have evolved, and most folks are no longer, they're like, I need to do some management leadership development. They're a lot more thoughtful about what they're going to do. They may choose to do still an MBA program, and a lot of the universities have evolved to say, let me take my MBA program, cut it up into bits, and repackage it as a customized leadership development program. So I understand what you're saying, and I agree, though it's evolved. It's very much evolved out there. And when I talk about this, I don't talk about this as the MBA program is good or the MBA program is bad. In fact, that's not what I'm discussing. I'm simply showing how this has evolved from an alternative form of education into something that's management development directly in the workplace. But yes, point taken.
Thank you.
So the point to finish with this is little cycles. Professor talks for 2-3 minutes, students talk for 2-3 minutes, 10-minute cycle, you have 90 minutes, do that 9 times. So rather than what's going on right now, I'm going to talk for 45 minutes, then I'm going to give you something to do for 45 minutes, it would be a little bit of talk, a little bit of discussion, a little bit of talk, a little bit of discussion. And while that discussion is going, me as a lecturer, trainer, whatever, I'm having a coffee. I'm just sitting back and I'm not getting involved. That's for all of you, otherwise I might start talking and that's going to muck up the discussion that's going on. So what we did with Coaching Ourselves is we just said, great, let me just get rid of the classroom, get rid of the professor, and that's a lot cheaper and a lot easier, and tell people they can do this on their own. And it started with that idea. And that's what these little groups are. You got a bit of content on each page, which is the professor talking, and then you have a discussion. So then some people will say, well, we don't understand the content. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that's fine. So why don't you talk about it and try to make sense of it for yourselves, but really talk about what you do at work. You're not supposed to talk about the content because that's not that's important. That's just there to frame your own dialogue and discussion to make sense. It'll give you a lot of useful input, but don't get bogged down with that doesn't work here and this and that. Who cares? Just keep going and it'll work itself out. And this picture, which you've seen, this is a precursor to Coaching Ourselves, and this is a fellow Carlos who also started in Mexico City, and he just part of the project with Henry, and he just said, I'm just going to redo this in my office. And when I started Coaching Ourselves, I wanted to do Henry's program in 2003, but I couldn't afford it. But I realized, Henry says, reflect on natural experience in light of conceptual ideas. He never says professors, so that's a lot cheaper, and he never says go to McGill. So it was really easy to just get going in my own office and bring the team together and say, hey guys, we're going to talk about what's going on around us. We're going to call it a learning meeting. One quick point. I was an engineering manager. I was a director. I had a bunch of young managers. I said, let's reflect on our own experience in light of conceptual ideas. Like, they thought I'd lost it. Right? They thought, reflect on your own experience. And we do things. We're engineers, right? We don't reflect. That's a complete waste of time. And I said, yeah, maybe, but I'm your boss, so you got to show up to my meeting. Right, so they had to come to my meeting, and I said, this is what we're going to do. Henry says we're going to reflect on natural experience in light of conceptual ideas. And that was it. That was my agenda, right? Reflect on natural experience, and here's the conceptual ideas. And so at first it was pretty hard, right? What do we say? Do I give you the status? Do we solve a problem? No, you talk about what you did yesterday, you know. So, but fairly quickly, actually enormously quickly, surprisingly quickly, you get a group of 4 or 5 folks together, and they'll start off talking very fast, and they'll get the idea of why this is useful. Not all the time. I've done probably hundreds and hundreds of groups, and I've had some horrendous failures of getting in there with a group of folks, and they just won't say anything no matter how hard I try to get them to talk, and that's fine. You know, you'll start off 50 groups in an organization, and there'll be like, say, 3 groups that just, they never want to meet because they don't like each other because it's not working. And I'll be like, yeah, okay, fine. So I got 47 that worked. That's perfect. We don't have to focus on the failures, right? Let's focus on the 47 that are working, and the rest will work themselves out. We'll put them in another group. I just want to add 2 or 3 bits and pieces here just to further conceptualize this. I use this slide sometimes to talk about what's going on with coaching ourselves, with peer learning, and essentially it's on the right side. So the idea is all of this is useful, nothing's good or bad here, but when you're helping managers learn, you want to help them to extract learning out of work. And so what's happening is their work learning improved work. So then the question is, well, how do I know that the work's improved? Right? Ultimately, that's the whole point of any intervention. Something has to get better, something has to change, they work better together, the products come out quicker, faster, whatever it is. That's the whole objective. So how do I evaluate whether work is improved? And yes, you're going to ask them questions. Is this worthwhile? Are you doing anything better? Yes or no? You know, that kind of stuff. Would you rather be at another meeting instead of this one? You're adults, you can make up your own mind. But you also have to ask their bosses. So ultimately, you have to have a very simple discussion. Hey, you know, your folks just did 6 90-minute sessions over the last 6 months. Do you notice any difference? Has it made any difference whatsoever? You ask people to use their judgment. Ultimately, that's, the managers are there. They're going to bring in data and their judgment, and then they're going to make a call on, yeah, you know what, this is really making a difference for my organization or my team. Let's do it for another 6 months. Or, you know what, nothing's changed. So fine, don't do it. And that's the end of it. And that's the way that we approach this idea of evaluation of this kind of an intervention. Use your judgment. Ask your managers to use their judgment, which is going to be a combination of quantitative and qualitative factors, which is what they do every day on the job anyhow. Second to last piece in terms of the theoretical view. This is the work of John Seely Brown. You should read some of his stuff. He was head of Xerox PARC for a while, and now he's doing a lot of work in gamification and social learning within virtual environments and these sort of things. But he has this wonderful way of framing this difference between a Cartesian view of learning and a social view of learning. And it helped me understand what's going on when you get a group of people to talk about what's going on. So the Cartesian view of learning is what we know implicitly. We were all in elementary school and high school. Learning is a substance, and you know, people learn because you transfer the substance from the person who knows it to the person who doesn't. And then in theory, they're going to be better at producing the products and services for your organization. So that's Cartesian view of learning. Social view of learning, as John Seely Brown talks about, is this idea of we participate, therefore we are. So an understanding is socially constructed, and it assumes our understanding is constructed through talking about content, through interactions around real-life experiences. And that's the way he's framing the social view of learning. And this idea of doing peer coaching is very much social learning. The point that's important about the social view of learning, and this is the point, you know, you'll get a lot of folks, they'll say, yeah, we're going to start these peer coaching groups, and they'll say, well, we really need a senior person in each group, right? Because otherwise it's not going to work. And you don't actually need a senior person in each group, but what they're telling you when they say they need a senior person in each group is they think it's Cartesian learning. They think that the senior person is going to be telling the junior people what to do and what not to do. Now, it's very helpful to have a senior person in a group. Frequently, the senior person is far better at facilitating than the junior people because they've been around the block a lot more, but it's not because the senior person is going to tell all the junior people what they should and should not do that the learning is going to occur. And of course, that takes you to this last piece, the difference between learning about management and learning to be management. And frankly, when you get a group of managers together, you're creating a small community of practice. That's all you're doing. It's a little community of practice where folks are helping one another become better as practicing managers in the organization. And so social learning and coaching ourselves, lean-in circles, action learning, it's all really small communities of practice. And that's the way that we see this and these sort of larger interventions when you're doing this. Yeah, I'll mention this. This was this great theory. You can, Showers and Joyce, I believe they did it. They're well known in this particular domain of how to help secondary school systems. And they did an awful lot of work on peer coaching, and that's where they had a ton of money, so they could start hundreds of these peer coaching groups, and they proved beyond a doubt that you don't need a senior person in the group to have the impact that you're looking for. And also, what we all know is, as soon as people start to try to tell each other what to do and what not to do, the backs get up. They go, yeah, sure, it breaks down. And that's one of the important things when you're doing these kind of coaching ourselves groups, and if you're facilitating it, some people might immediately start off with that, I'm going to solve the problem. I'm going to help you solve your problem and tell you what to do because I know what's going on. And the other person's going to listen, real politely and quietly and completely ignore you. So it's not that kind of a discussion that's going on there. It's a far more open discussion. And in some senses, it's a coaching discussion as we would use the term coaching here in the West, which is helping people figure it out for themselves. One thing that we notice that's interesting with coaching ourselves, you might do coaching ourselves with a single team, and that's great. You'll get a lot of impact. You might do it with 3 or 4 teams. Once you start to enter an organization and you get hundreds of teams all doing this, then you start to see a broader impact on the organization because of a shared language, a shared experience, and a shared context. And that's where the idea of building a broader sense of community starts to evolve in the organization. And you really can see or you can feel, I should say, in other words, the senior leaders will talk about the feeling of a different sense of folks working together and talking with each other. That doesn't happen all the time. That's actually rather rare, and it takes a long time. And you're going to enter a lot of organizations, and I'm sure all of you, where you get, people just don't talk, or they're too afraid, or they talk endlessly but never say anything of any substance. Like, it takes a long time to get to something like that in some cases. And in some cases, they've already got it, and you just strengthen what they already have. So now I want to try a module. You should all have a copy of a module called Strategic Blind Spots on the table. The instructions are pretty simple. They're written right there. If you're in a table of 3, then I'd ask you to split up. You need at least 4 or 5 in a table. So 2 tables of 3 could combine to a table of 6. Otherwise, the discussion just won't be rich enough.